Okay, that sounds good. Okay, excuse me. Most of this, I think you've already gone through, hopefully. Of course, the exam is going to be available pretty much all day on Sunday. And once you start it, of course, you'll have 75 minutes to finish it. And it's going to be 50 multiple choice questions, 2 points each, for a total of 100 points. uh, so, if you're doing it late, be sure you give yourself that 75 minutes before 10 p.m. To finish it. So in this review guidelines for the exam, I've put together questions from the different sections of the class that a lot of them are sort of just to get you thinking about certain things and to ask yourself, do I really know such and such of a type of concept or fact? And so, the first part here I think of as pretty much review. If everybody's has the prerequisite of an introductory nutrition course under their belt, and so some of this is a lot of this is review. Sort of things like the three major functions of nutrients in the human body. uh, those are things that you should just have off the top of your head, right? Uh, One is to contribute to energy, calories, right? One is to regulate body functions, and another is to provide structure to the body components. So those are the key things. Protein does all three of those. uh, and so think about how the other macronutrients fit into those three major functions, and the micronutrients too. Uh, the rest of these, let's see. This first part I'm going to go through pretty quickly because I think where we want to spend most of our time is probably on the energy chapter and the carbohydrate chapter. Uh, essential nutrients, we talk about usually when we use the term nutrients, we mean an essential nutrient, although there's sometimes we think of certain nutrients as non-essential. Things like glucose, for example. Uh, that's a nutrient, but do you have to have it in your diet? Not really. We can produce that from other things. Another interesting nutrient would be dietary fiber. Uh, does that meet the definition of essential nutrient? Not really. We could live without dietary fiber. Our intestinal system wouldn't function as well, probably, and eventually we could have problems with that. But some people have to have fiber-free diets for various intestinal issues, and they live a long time just because we don't absorb fiber, we don't need fiber for our body functions. But we think of it as a nutrient because it's beneficial as a dietary component for body function. And let's see, we want you to also think about diets, what type of diets are most likely to meet essential nutrient needs. This is why we have these systems where we have different food groups that if you consume foods from each of the different food groups and within a reasonable variety of foods within each food group, you are likely to meet your essential nutrient needs, especially if you're consuming an adequate number of calories. So meeting your nutrient needs depends on not only the types of foods you consume, but how much food you're consuming. The more food you consume, the more easy it is to meet your vitamin and mineral needs, that sort of thing. So if you have an athlete that's restricting calories, for example, uh, then it's harder for them to meet their vitamin and mineral needs, especially, and possibly even something like protein. Uh, so non-essential nutrients, we talked about that. Uh, What are some of the likely nutrient deficiencies that occur in various types of vegetarian diets? I think that's an important thing to think about. A fair amount of athletes will consume vegetarian diets with the belief that they're somehow more healthful, which is debatable. That sort of thing. So, but think about, you know, what would likely be potentially inadequate. So if you had an athlete that you're counseling and on a vegetarian diet, what things would you want to make sure they're getting enough of? And then, of course, all the DRIs, I'm not going to go through those here, but you should know what the EAR is and the RDA and the AI and what are the criteria used to establish them? How do we use them in terms of applying them, that sort of thing. Also, by the way, feel free, like I mentioned earlier, I think, chime in if you have a question on something that's going by and or need clarification on something that I'm just skimming over too fast. Anything like that is fine. Fair game. Let's see. You know, one of the things that's talked about in the book a bit is the exchange system. You know, think about how that works, how it can be used to help people meet their macronutrient needs. It's mainly just designed for meeting macronutrient and calorie needs. What's nutrient density? How is that applied? You know, when we think of nutrient density, usually we're applying that to an individual nutrient at a time. So we'd say, okay, what is the nutrient density for calcium in milk? That sort of thing. Sometimes people will use it in a general term, saying, you know, a diet has high nutrient density, but that's pretty vague when you think about it. What do they mean by that? What does it mean? It's dense in all nutrients? It's hard to say what's meant by that term. So usually it's just applied to a single nutrient. And again, it's how much of that nutrient is in a food relative to the calories in that food. And that can be confusing sometimes too, because sometimes people will take a food like kale, for example, you know, and the amount of calcium in there relative to the calories is extremely high because the calories are so low in that kind of food. But in order to get very much of that particular nutrient, you might have to eat cups of kale. You wouldn't get much calories, but so if you ate a typical serving of a food like that, excuse me, you still might not get much of that nutrient that has a high nutrient density. So it's good to distinguish between the types of foods. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the minerals section, especially on calcium. I'll emphasize some of the nutrient density issues related to calcium. Some of the rest of these things are just common knowledge type things. Let's see. I'm going to skip over. Well, let's see. No, let's talk a little bit about some of these things. Let's see. Respiratory exchange ratio. This is not covered much, if at all, in the textbook, but I did go over this in my presentation. And I think it's an important concept to know. Those of you who have taken exercise physiology have been exposed to this probably in some detail. If you haven't had a class like that, it may be the first time you've encountered it. But basically, it's looking at the ratio between CO2 produced and oxygen consumed. And the reason we like to do this is because that ratio tells us a lot about what fuel source the individual is using while we're measuring their respiratory exchange. By respiratory exchange, we mean how much oxygen is being taken up by the body and how much carbon dioxide is being produced by the body. And so that, of course, we measure with respiratory respiratory equipment, usually always in a laboratory setting where we can actually, put a nose clip on the person, and so we're only measuring what's going in and out of their mouth, in and out of their lungs, in other words, and getting these measurements. I think I posted some links to videos on how this is done in a laboratory setting. So if you're not clear on this, take a look at those videos. There's plenty of them on YouTube. You should know sort of what these respiratory exchange ratios mean. What are the body's energy sources at a respiratory exchange ratio of 1.0? That's generally the highest it goes, except under certain conditions that are extremely high intensity, where the person is blowing off excess CO2 for a while, it can actually go over 1.0. But under most conditions, that's the highest it goes. And when it's 1.0, it's indicating that the person is burning virtually 100% carbohydrate for their energy supply. If it's down to 0.7, that means they're burning virtually all fat as their energy source. And respiratory exchange ratio like 0.82 is typically in the range of what you would be observing for somebody who's just burning a mixture of fat and carbohydrate, sort of a mixed diet type of situation. Might be your respiratory exchange ratio at rest if you're consuming pretty much a mixed diet and consuming both carbohydrate, or burning both carbohydrate and fat. Okay, so other things, of course, VO2 max, that's the maximal capacity to consume oxygen, which is often used as a measure of an athlete's capacity for aerobic exercise, and is somewhat of a predictor for somebody's potential as an athlete for aerobic type activity. And so there's a lot of stuff we've gone over about how it is affected by training. Generally, your VO2 max will increase if you've been training aerobically. Not likely to see that with strength training or anaerobic type training. And then we talked about calorimetry a fair amount. And what we're usually talking about is indirect calorimetry, which you should remember is where we are measuring. Well, first of all, let's step back and say, what is calorimetry? What's that really mean? It just means measuring calories, right? Now, a calorie is a measure of heat, right? And so direct calorimetry is directly measuring the heat that somebody's body is producing. So that's not easy to do. So more commonly, we will do indirect calorimetry, where we are indirectly determining calorie expenditure by measuring oxygen consumption primarily, and to some extent CO2 production. The doubly labeled water method is one that is done for long periods of time. So if you want to see what's going on with people over a period of days, or usually a few days or several days, then what they do is they give them a dose of this doubly labeled water, and there are various measurements that we won't go into that can allow them to determine basically their calorie or energy expenditure over that period of time. So this is not something that you could use for measuring resting energy expenditure. It's just for long periods of time. We'd have to use, and typically indirect calorimetry is going to be used for measuring resting energy expenditure. Direct calorimetry could be used for that, but usually it's not. So, okay, any questions anybody has so far on things I've rambled about here before we go into carbohydrates? Okay. You are also well behaved. You've even got your cell phones turned off and stuff, I think. Just kidding. Lousy joke. Okay, moving on. What are the major monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides? These are all review things that you should have had in a nutrition course already. So I'm not going to go through them here. Main thing to think about is uh, all of these digestible carbohydrates basically are primarily converted into glucose in the liver once they get absorbed and taken into the body. And then they circulate as blood glucose. Glycemic index and glycemic load, just ways of looking at how different carbohydrate containing foods affect the rise in blood glucose. So we're looking at how fast and how much blood glucose goes up, how long it stays up, that sort of thing, after a measured dose of carbohydrate. And usually that measured dose is 50 grams of carbohydrate in that food. And we went into looking at some things in the lecture already, even looking at things like taro and poi and some of local interest types of foods. And sometimes, you might want, in general, we tend to talk about glycemic index where the high glycemic index foods are, quote, bad, and the low glycemic index diet is better for you overall. And a lower glycemic load would be preferable. And that sort of thing. However, there are certain conditions where you would want a high glycemic index source of carbohydrate. That would be, of course, during exercise, where an athlete wants to absorb that carbohydrate as rapidly as possible to keep a good supply of glucose going to the working muscles. So under those kind of exercise conditions, you would want a high glycemic index, usually beverage, possibly a food like a gel or something that you'd also probably wash down with water anyway. Blood glucose regulation, of course, just looking at the interplay between insulin and glucagon and that sort of thing. Let's see. Okay, throughout these different topic areas, we're really asking a lot of times the question, how does exercise training affect things? Uh, the body goes through a lot of changes during exercise training, and we've already looked at some of the things in muscle tissue, especially that change, like number of mitochondria and transporters and the ability to store glycogen and triglycerides. All these things change with adaptation to training. And so there are certain conditions where consuming carbohydrate during exercise would benefit performance, but if you're doing just short duration, high intensity strength exercise, unlikely to be of any benefit. Let's see. Approximate maximum amount of carbohydrate energy that can be utilized from sports beverages during exercise. We talked about this a bit. In general, we say if it's just glucose that somebody's taking in, they can probably absorb about a gram of glucose per minute. But if it is a mixture of carbohydrate sources, that can be more than that. And then carbohydrate intolerance, lactose intolerance, of course, most of you are familiar with that, covered in an introductory course. Basically, when you don't efficiently digest the sugar lactose, and then it proceeds down into the lower intestine, where the bacteria have a party and break it down and produce gas and possibly cause diarrhea and things like that. We sometimes can see an intolerance from high fructose intake too. Fructose is absorbed more slowly than glucose. And so when very high amounts of fructose are taken in, it might not be absorbed fast enough and can proceed down into the lower intestine, large intestine, and cause problems. Adequate fiber, we can skim over that, I think. What levels of carbohydrate consumption are recommended for endurance athletes? You can just you should review that so you have a ballpark idea anyway. And then there's also a section where we covered the carbohydrate and protein mixtures. Some athletes that I've known have really felt that having some protein along with the carbohydrate, even during a long event like an Ironman triathlon, was beneficial, and it seemed to help them. There has been study on that, and some of the studies have been a mixed bag of results, but you'll hear some people claiming that they like to combine the two. Part of the reason that there might be some benefits to that is that amino acids can be absorbed separately from carbohydrate, and once they're taken into the body, they can help trigger increased insulin release, and so therefore increased uptake of both amino acids and glucose. And then we talked about, body cells that are highly dependent on a steady supply of glucose for normal function. Think about that. There are really two major types of cells in the body that use glucose almost exclusively. The red blood cells use only glucose. So red blood cells don't have mitochondria in them. So all they do is they take glucose and they break it down to lactic acid and release the lactic acid. Take up another molecule of glucose, metabolize it anaerobically to lactic acid. So they are strictly dependent on glucose as their energy source. Now the brain is somewhat similar. It uses primarily glucose as an energy source also. However, it can also use ketone bodies to some extent. Ketones, of course, are a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism. And the important thing about that is largely related to long-term starvation, which we didn't really go into when I was talking about this in the previous carbohydrate slides. But if somebody is starving for a long period of time, of course, they have no glucose coming in from the diet, and they use up their glycogen stores within a day or two, and then they have to rely completely on gluconeogenesis, primarily from amino acids, to get glucose. Over time, the body says, hey, we can't waste our body protein so much. And so the brain starts getting better at using ketones as an energy source. It always requires glucose, but it can decrease its glucose requirement and increase its use of ketones in those starvation conditions. Normally, you don't see too much ketone use by the brain in more healthy conditions, but that hasn't been looked at, as far as I know, very much in like ultra endurance type events where perhaps you might see some stresses like that. But usually even in ultra endurance events, the athlete can take in a steady source of carbohydrate. And so you probably would not see an adaptation like that. So, okay, any pressing carbohydrate questions before we move into fat? Okay, well, let's look at fat then as an energy source during exercise. And of course, the first part of the chapter on fats, like most of the chapters in your textbook are just going over the sort of the general concepts to try to bring you back up to speed on things you probably already learned at one point. Major forms of lipids in foods and in the body. Of course, lipids in foods are primarily as triglycerides. And when we store fat in the body, it's also stored as triglycerides, mostly in fat cells, but also we store triglycerides in muscle tissue as well. And we call that intramuscular triglycerides typically. Food sources of fat, I think everybody's clear on that. Functions of various lipids in the body. When we talk about lipids as a group, of course, it's not just triglycerides. We're also talking about phospholipids and sterols like cholesterol. And so think about all the different functions that they have in the body. And then what's essential? Are there, about the only thing when you think about this category that's strictly essential would be the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We don't require the sterols like cholesterol, although there may be some benefit to having some cholesterol in the diet. That's debatable. But we have to get the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Those we cannot make in the body. And other than that, those are really the essential nutrients now. But fats have a lot of different functions, though, too, that maybe would not meet the essential nutrient definition. Things like enhancing the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients and fat-soluble phytochemicals and things like that. So usually it's good to have some fat in a meal, especially a meal where you want to absorb things like, say, the carotenoids from vegetables, that sort of thing. When studies have looked at absorbing the carotenoids from carrots, for example, and we find that if you just chew up a raw carrot, you absorb some of those carotenoids that the body can convert to vitamin A. But if you cook those carrots and then chew them up and swallow them, you actually absorb more beta carotene than you did from the raw carrot. Now, if you take those cooked carrots and you eat them with some butter on them, you will absorb even more of those carotenoids than without the butter, because the fat increasing absorption of the fat-soluble carotenoids, and so on. So dipping your raw carrot in peanut butter maybe would be a good idea too, to increase absorption of those carotenoids in the raw carrot. So lots of different things to think about, how different food components interact with each other and that sort of thing. We talked briefly about medium chain fatty acids and how those are handled differently. There was research done on these, thinking that there may be some value to them because when you consume those, they're not absorbed into the lymphatic system. They go straight to the liver through the portal vein. And since with the longer fatty acids, which are most of the fatty acids in triglycerides from the diet, those have to go into the lymphatic system, and it takes much longer for them to end up in the blood. So medium chain triglyceride type fatty acids will end up in the blood more quickly. So we were thinking that maybe that would be a good thing to enhance certain types of exercise. But the results on studying those haven't been that impressive, as it turns out. And then thinking about, we talked about how exercise intensity affects fuel supply. And certainly exercise intensity, are you going to burn more fat at a high exercise intensity or a low intensity exercise? I think most of you realize now that one of the ways I think about it is we've got, two major fuels during exercise. That's carbohydrate and fat. Carbohydrate is like high octane fuel. Fat is like regular. And so if you have to go at a high intensity, your body's going to switch over to that high octane carbohydrate energy source as long as it's there to be utilized. If we're just cruising along at a slow to moderate pace, we can run more on regular, and we don't have to use very much high octane fuel. We don't have to use much carb. So one way to think about it anyway. And then, one of the things that we spent some time on in the lecture was those graphs showing, where the energy is coming from for working muscle. And you might go back and look at those graphs carefully at 3 different intensities of exercise. And you might remember that, we had basically 2 sources of carbohydrate. That would be carbohydrate from muscle glycogen, so right in the muscle, and carbohydrate taken up from the blood in the form of blood glucose. And then there are 2 forms of fat, intramuscular triglycerides and fatty acids being taken up from the blood. In other words, delivered by fat cells through the blood to the working muscle. And so at lower intensities of exercise, think about that fat is going to be a major fuel source. But as we increase the intensity of exercise, remember we increase the total amount of calories being expended too. And so even though at say 65% of VO2 max, sort of a jogging pace, we're burning a lower percentage of calories from fat, we're actually burning more total fat than we did at the 25% because we're burning so much more, having a much greater calorie expenditure. So take a look at those graphs, make sure you have those clear in your head. And since it's an open book test, that's one thing you might want to keep at hand. I probably have questions on that. Endurance exercise training turns us into better butter burners. Some people have called it. In other words, we get better at relying on fat for fuel after we adapt to endurance exercise through training. And so at a given intensity of exercise, we'll more likely have a better capacity to rely on fat. Obviously at high intensities though, even if you're well adapted to endurance exercise, you will have to use carbohydrate as an energy source. And once you run out of that, you have to slow down. When we talk about fats, there's all the apoproteins, lipoproteins, things like that. We didn't go into that a whole lot, but you should have some concept of what their functions are and how they play a role in delivering fat and other lipid components to cells in the body. AMDR, again, we talked about earlier on the DRIs and the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. It's a mouthful, or AMDR is for macronutrients, obviously. And so you should know, what percent of total calorie intake is recommended for fat, for carbohydrate, and protein. And the last thing in here is carnitine. We talked about carnitine a bit, but carnitine, of course, plays a role in transporting fatty acids into mitochondria. So it's been studied to see if it can enhance fat utilization in muscle tissue. Mixed bag of results on that. So, okay, any questions related to fat before I move on to protein? Okay. Yep. Hold on here. Jumping around on me. Okay, protein. Obviously, the components of protein are amino acids. Review how protein is digested, absorbed, transported in the body. You might remember that stomach acid is an important part of protein digestion, and people who are on different drugs that are being taken for things like gastroesophageal reflux or heartburn are taking drugs that reduce stomach acid production that can compromise protein digestion because you won't get enough of the stomach acid denaturing the protein. What do we mean by denaturing the protein? We mean that it helps unravel those protein strands that are often all sort of tangled up and difficult to get at by the digestive enzymes. How is it absorbed? Remember that we absorb free amino acids and di and tripeptides. And then what happens after those get absorbed? Where does it go in the body? How does it get utilized? What can we do with it? Of course, a lot of options exist for protein. Body's first choice typically is to use it for protein synthesis. If we have a whole lot of extra, of course, we can convert it to either glucose or fat. And everybody knows what element is present in protein that's not found in fat and carbohydrate, right? Protein is mainly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, like fat and carbohydrate, but it also has nitrogen. And there's a couple of amino acids that have sulfur too. How many amino acids are used for protein synthesis? Part of the reason to think about that is that there are 20 of them, but there are other amino acids also that can be consumed that we talk about a bit that are used for other things, not protein synthesis. And then how many of these are essential? Of the 20 are essential. How many need to be consumed in the diet? Let's see, which essential amino acid is most commonly low in people's diets around the world? Anybody remember that one? We talked about that a fair amount. That would be lysine. And then we talked about protein quality too. And what are the major aspects of protein quality and how we determine them? Those two major aspects are what's the mixture of amino acids? In other words, do the essential amino acids in the food protein source come close to matching our body's needs? The closer they are, the higher the quality of the protein, but we also need to account for how digestible those proteins are. So those are the two things, the pattern of essential amino acids and the digestibility of that protein. Okay, we talked about these protein quality measurements, and I refer you to go back to the PowerPoint presentation video on that if you're foggy on it. But basically, again, it's looking at protein digestibility and what's called amino acid score. So PDCAAS stands for Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. So amino acid score is just a way of saying how well does that amino acid pattern in that protein compare to the ideal. And often that's expressed as an amino acid score. And then that's corrected for protein digestibility. And so protein can have a good amino acid score, yet not rate that high because its digestibility is low. Or it could have high digestibility, but a low amino acid score, and so it still would be not ranked as a high quality protein. The DIAAS, the one, digestible indispensable amino acid score, is used, it's a little bit better measure, but basically what the difference is there is it's measuring the digestibility of the protein we're studying at the end of the small intestine. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, because when if protein is not digested by then it proceeds into the small intestine, into the large intestine, the colon, and that's where the microbiome of bacteria have their way with it. And so they can break it down, use it for their own purposes, convert it to other things. But basically down there, we don't get much of it, if any. And so we're really more concerned with what we get in the small intestine. And so that's what that method is measuring. So there's a lot of places to look at protein digestibility and which ones have higher digestibility, typically plant proteins or animal proteins. I often hear people get this wrong. Somehow people instinctively think, oh, animal proteins are really hard to digest, but plant proteins are not. Well, it's just the opposite. Animal proteins are much more digestible than most plant proteins. And of course, with the plant proteins, it depends on the plant and the form. So for example, tofu has pretty good digestibility. The protein in tofu, pretty good digestibility, comparable pretty much to most animal proteins. But the plant protein, say from just cooked soybean, would not be as high as the tofu. Recommended intakes, RDA for protein. Most everybody's familiar with that, I think. AMDR, which I don't especially like because it doesn't make any sense unless you apply it to someone who's meeting their calorie needs in their diet. But it's something we should know. And can a vegetarian diet be designed to meet protein needs? Of course, the answer there is yes. And however, you want to make sure that the vegetarian diet includes a reasonable mixture of protein sources. And we often talk about that as complementary protein foods. And so we talked about which foods have lysine as a limiting amino acid typically, and which ones have methionine as a limiting amino acid. And so generally, grains are low in lysine, and legumes or beans are relatively high in lysine, but low in methionine. So grains are high in methionine, you eat them together, and you can usually meet your essential amino acid needs. And what about this question? Compared to an omnivorous diet, which includes animal protein, of course, does a vegetarian diet need more or less protein to meet protein needs? And why? Well, probably from what we just talked about, you can figure that overall, the protein in a vegetarian diet has a lower digestibility. So to absorb the same amount of total amino acids from a vegetarian diet, you need more protein. So you need a higher protein intake because you're absorbing a lower percentage of the protein being consumed. So if you just eat more of it, you can absorb as much. Let's see. And this question is an interesting one to think about. When protein is consumed in amounts greater than what the body needs, what are the body's options to utilize it? And I'm not going to go into it in great detail here because we kind of talked about it already. But again, as you might remember, you can convert. Well, first of all, you can just use those amino acids as energy sources for calories, and then you just have to get rid of the nitrogen, which generally goes into the liver and gets converted to urea, the form of urea, to carry that out of the body in the urine. And you also, of course, can convert those amino acids. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them can be converted to glucose. All of them could be potentially converted to acetyl-CoA and then be used to synthesize fatty acids or ketones. So those are your options. So quite a few options for protein. Obviously, first choice is to synthesize body protein. Remember which amino acids are oxidized largely in muscle cells, and where some amino acids are used more and partly for energy supply in muscle cells, especially when you get in the latter stages, say, of an endurance event and the muscles are running low on carbohydrate. They will turn to, remember, the branched chain amino acids. Those are released from muscle protein breakdown and can be utilized in the muscle for energy. And this is one reason why branched chain amino acids are sometimes studied to be taken in as a supplement during exercise, with the concept that perhaps that will reduce muscle protein breakdown and basically help the body rely more on carbohydrate for energy, because it won't have to break down its muscle tissue as much. And then there's certain amino acids that we talked about that, excuse the garbage there, that carry the nitrogen out of muscles. So the branched chain amino acids are broken down in muscles, but they're releasing their nitrogen when they get broken down. And you might remember that pyruvate largely picks up the nitrogen, and then pyruvate becomes alanine, the amino acid alanine, when it takes up that nitrogen. And the alanine leaves the muscle tissue, goes into the blood, and can be taken up by the liver, where it can then be used for gluconeogenesis to produce glucose. Now, remember another amino acid that leaves muscle tissue, and this is going on all the time, but somewhat during exercise too, and that's glutamine. Glutamine, again, is really an important amino acid that gets utilized by the immune system cells and the intestinal tract cells. And it's used as an energy source, strangely enough. And so having a good supply of that is important. And what we find is people with greater muscle mass sometimes do better in terms of their immune system function, because their muscle mass can provide more glutamine than somebody with lower muscle mass. And so that is an issue sometimes in elderly people who tend to lose a lot of muscle mass as they get older, and that can compromise their immune function then. And that's when sometimes we find that supplementing a person with that amino acid may potentially benefit their immune function. Doesn't seem to be the case too much in most athletes, though. Okay, let's see. Moving along here, what is the central fatigue hypothesis? And, this is one of those things when you see central fatigue hypothesis or syndrome terms like that, it means that it's not proven really. But there are logical explanations for it to possibly be true. And so there are certain amino acids proposed to be involved here. And how are they involved? I don't know why I have how in red there, but anyway, involved in meeting and affecting fatigue. And what we're talking about there is when the brain takes up more tryptophan, then the brain can produce more serotonin, which tends to make you feel a little lazier and possibly more fatigued, is the theory. So when there's more branched chain amino acids in the blood, they block the uptake of tryptophan, and that would decrease then the brain's capacity to produce serotonin, and theoretically then not feel as fatigued. You may have heard of drugs for treating depression that are called serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are designed to increase serotonin in the brain. And theoretically, that helps with decreasing decreasing depression in some individuals. So call those SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. So, okay, moving on here, making good progress, I think. Why do athletes need more protein? We spent a very fair amount of time on this, and it's discussed well in your book also. And compared to the RDA, how much greater are these recommendations for athletes? How you might look at how they vary depending on the type of athlete, whether they're endurance athletes or high intensity athletes, that sort of thing. And then other question here, can an athlete's protein needs generally be met by the diet? And what would you want to know to answer that question? You probably would want to know, is the athlete meeting their calorie needs? If an athlete is on a diet to control body weight, say for a sport like wrestling, where they have to meet a certain weight target, they may not be eating enough calories to easily meet their protein needs. And under those conditions, a protein supplement might be very beneficial. For most athletes who are meeting their calorie needs, let's say that, it's not unusual for an athlete in training to require 3,500 to 5,000 calories per day. When an athlete's eating that many calories on a reasonably mixed diet, they're highly likely to meet their protein needs. So protein supplements can be very helpful if an athlete, though, is on a calorie restricted diet, because the last thing you want them to lose is body protein usually in order to make weight. You want them to lose fat and possibly, depending on the type of sport, possibly keeping their glycogen stores down. One of the things you might remember is when you store glycogen in the body, for every gram of glycogen, your body takes up about 3 grams of water too. And so, it's easy to store, I would say, roughly a pound of glycogen. And so if you are able to store a pound of glycogen, that's going to increase body weight by 3 or 4 pounds. So that's one way to lose weight quickly, is to just lose carbs. That's why a lot of these low carb diets get people excited, because you just cut the carbs out of their diet and they lose 3 or 4 pounds in a matter of 2 days, and they think they lost fat. They didn't lose any fat, probably. They just lost their glycogen. And but the scale looked real nice. The pounds went down, but it was mostly water loss. which types of protein foods supply the most protein with the least calories. We had a particular slide or two in the PowerPoint presentation that looked at that. In general, the foods that require less calorie consumption to get a lot of protein are foods that are just protein foods. So generally that's animal protein foods. Plant protein foods usually come along with either carbohydrate, when you're looking at something like legumes or beans, they have a fair amount of carbohydrate and a bit of fat. And the protein in nuts requires consuming a fair amount of fat along with it too. So you get the calories from either carbs or fat along with that protein. Let's see. And then, we talked a little bit about, how much you would rely on protein as an energy source during exercise. And generally during exercise, as long as you have plenty of glycogen available, the body's not going to use protein much. And it's probably going to contribute only roughly maybe 5% to the energy supply, where carbohydrate and fat are handling most of it. However, in a long event, when an athlete has depleted their glycogen, then the body does turn more to protein breakdown in muscle tissue. And that protein can start supplying energy. Rarely does it exceed about 15% of the energy supply, but it'll go from the lower level of 5% to as high as 15%. Usually, again, in the later stages of a long event where glycogen's depleted. And then, of course, if the body is turning to protein as an energy source, significant energy source, it's dumping the nitrogen. And so your body has to handle that nitrogen. How is it going to do that? Well, obviously, it's going to be transported to the liver. The liver is going to convert it primarily to the form of urea, and then it will be put back into the blood by the liver, go through the blood to the kidneys, be released, removed and released in the urine. And then we spent a bit of time talking about the different protein-related substances that are promoted as ergogenic aids and which ones are supported by research. I'm just going to encourage you to go back over some of that. One of the ones that we talked about the most probably was creatine. And creatine is one of those that actually has some good research supporting its use for certain types of exercise efforts, only the short duration exercise efforts, where you're primarily relying on ATP and creatine phosphate to replenish the ATP. So we're talking about up to maybe 30 seconds of exercise, where creatine supplementation seems to help. So higher intensity stuff that you're going all out for just say up to 30 seconds or so. So those are the main things I want to cover. We've been rambling here for about an hour already. So do any of you have questions that you want to throw out there about anything related to the exam or otherwise? And I think, of course, I've been recording this too. So if something went by too fast, you can go back and look at it. I'll also be having, of course, 2 more of these Zoom sessions later in the week, one on Thursday and one on Saturday morning. So if you found this helpful, you can look at it over again. And but I encourage you to use those study questions. I think those will help a lot. I'm not going to claim that they cover everything that will be in the exam, but probably at least 90, 95% of what's going to be in the exam. And so that's pretty much what I have to say. Any questions or comments? Okay, I see a comment. Helpful. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. And so anyway, I hope everyone is doing well and keeps avoiding COVID well. I fortunately just got my second COVID shot over the weekend, and so I'm starting to feel like I might be protected. and but I'm of that age, 3/4 of a century now, where I qualified to get my COVID shot already. All right, well, I'm going to end this session then, if there aren't any other questions or comments. And I wish you good luck on the exam.